Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of the podcast, and we're continuing our study of the second book of Samuel, that's Shmuel Bet. We are in chapter 12, that's Perek Bet, and we are about to read verse 13. In the last podcast, Nathan has confronted David, exposed his sin, and declared to him that he is going to be punished, as the sword will never leave his household. In other words, there will be strife in his household, and that his sin will be exposed in public, as just as he had taken someone else's wives, his own wives will be taken from him. David's reaction is what we're about to read, and David's reaction was extremely simple. And from here we really learn how is a person supposed to admit his faults? How is a person supposed to approach God, or for that matter, anyone, when someone does something bad to someone else, when somebody hurts someone else? What is an apology supposed to sound like? And it's actually very simple, but that's the most meaningful. Vayomer David al Nasan, David said to Nathan, Chatasi ladonai, I have sinned to God. Basically, no excuses. David doesn't give a whole story about why he did, what he did, he could have done, he should have done, he might have done, but really, but maybe, but this. No, very simple. I have sinned. And of course, this stands in stark contrast to Saul's reaction when he was confronted with his sin. That was to give a whole bunch of excuses, and he didn't actually, rather than admit his fault. Obviously, this sin does not this admission here does not mitigate the gravity of what David had done. And what he had done will have lasting repercussions, and the suffering and the punishments will happen to David. However, and as we will read, the quality that David said over here, and try to compare this with many leaders that we are familiar with from our own times and from previous times, that when confronted with initially with the sins that they have committed, with the unethical and immoral acts that they had committed, their immediate reaction is always either to double down, or to say it didn't really happen, or to try to cover it up, to make excuses, to say, oh, but, to the whataboutisms, oh, but what about them, see what they did. No, that's not how David reacted. David reacted very simply, I have sinned, I am wrong. Vayomer Nasan el David, and David said, and Nathan said to David, Gam Adonai ha'avircha toscha, God has passed over your sin, lo tamus, you shall not die. What does this mean, ha'avir? It doesn't say he has forgiven, right? It doesn't say himchil chatascha, right? Or that his sliach, right? That he forgave it, but it says that he has passed over. He's not going, lo tamus, you shall not die. In other words, this isn't going to be your end. One wonders, had David reacted in a similar way to Saul, had David reacted with a million different excuses and cover-ups and mind-bending nonsense, what would have been Nathan's answer? What would God's answer through the prophet have been to David, had David started making excuses? One gets the sense, at least, obviously, anytime someone engages in the what if, or what would have been if, it's always a dangerous proposition, because no one really knows what would have been if. But one gets the sense from this verse that had David chosen a different route, the result would have been that God would not have been Havir Chatoso. He would not have passed over his sin, and that David would have been killed because of it. Ephes, however, and Nathan continues to say, it's not over. Because you have rejected the. Literally, this means the enemies of God. Now, this is something that we find in several places where it doesn't want to state, the verse doesn't want to state that someone has rejected God Himself. So it says the enemies of God, but it's a euphemism. It really refers to Nietz Niatzta, at God Himself, by doing this thing. Gam haben hayilod l'chal mos yamos. The son who will be born from this, most yamos, is going to die. The child is not going to make it. Vayelech nasan el beso. Nathan went home. Vayigof Adonai es hayeled asher yaldai shetur David vaye anash. And God struck the child that was born, the young boy that was born to the wife of Uriah. It's emphasizing her as the wife of Uriah, even though now technically she's David's wife. And he became struck with illness. He became very sick. Vayivakesh David esalem biyad hanar. And David prayed to God on behalf of the nar, of the boy. It uses a language nar, which is usually a language of a lad, which gives the impression that he wasn't an infant as he was dying, that he was a little older. That's unclear. But the language that it's used is before that it calls him the language a yeled, a boy, and now in this verse nar, which gives the idea of an even older lad, like 13, 14 years old. But it's hard to know because it doesn't specify this clearly from the verses itself, at least. Vayotzam David tzom, and David fasted a fast. Uvav vilon v'shachav arza, and he went in and spent the night lying down on the ground. And so David is lying on the ground, fasting, crying to God on behalf of this boy. One gets the impression that if it's an older child, he had already developed a bond of love for this boy. He's not given a name here in the verse, but he developed a tremendous love for his son, and now he's crying and fasting, crying to God. The elders of his house came to try to get him up. He is the king, after all. He has kingly duties to do, and he's lying on the floor of the house. He would not move. He would not give in to them. And he would not even eat together, which is bread with the elders, which is obviously one of the functions of the king, is to sit and dine with his advisors. But he wouldn't even do that. It was on the seventh day, presumably after he became ill. And the boy died. David and they were afraid to even inform him that the child had passed away. Ki amru, because they said and they thought when he was alive, we tried to speak to him and he wouldn't listen. And how could we tell him that the child has died and he might do something awful, which is understood by the commentaries, and it seems pretty clear that he's going to do something bad to himself. They were afraid David was going to harm himself, possibly even commit suicide over being so distraught. And clearly he is so distraught because of the tremendous amount of guilt, realizing that this death is occurring, that this had happened because of his behavior, because of the tremendous amount of guilt that he was living with, that you can imagine the possibility that he might hurt himself. Vayar David, and David saw ki avadav mitlachashim, that his servants were whispering to each other, that obviously something happened that they were keeping from him. Vayoven David gimei sayalet, and it was obvious, David understood from the behavior of the people around him that he had passed on. Vayomer David al avadav, so David asked them, Hamei sayalet, has he died? Vayomru meis, and they said, he has died. Vayakam David me'aretz, David at that point got up from lying down on the ground. Vayirchatz vayosech vayichalef simlosav, and he washed himself off from, obviously he gathered all kinds of dirt and junk from the ground, and he washed it all off. Vayosech, and he smeared himself with, anointed himself with oil. Vayichalef simlosav, and he changed into clean clothing. Vayavo beis Adonai, and he came to the house of God. Vayishtachu, and he bowed there, praying to God. Vayavo habeso, and then he came home. Vayishal, and he asked for food to eat. Vayasim lo lechem vayochal. He no longer had to fast. There was no longer any point to praying for the boy's recovery if he had passed. Vayomru avodav elav, and his servant said to him, "Ma hadavar hazeh asher asita?" What is this your behavior? You were so distraught over his illness. We'd think that you'd be even more distraught over his death. Bavor hayelad chai tzamta v'tev. When he was alive, you were fasting and crying. Now he passed on, and you're getting up and eating. So he said, Vayomer, verse 22, when he was still alive, I was fasting and crying. Because he's thinking, maybe God will have some mercy on me and allow the boy to live. But now Mace, he's dead. What's the purpose of fasting if it's over? Is there anything I can do to bring him back to life? I can go to him, but he can't come back to me. In other words, I can do everything I want, but nothing. The fate is sealed. It's over. There's no purpose in just dragging on the fasting and self torture. David David then went and comforted Bat-Sheva, his wife, Bat-Sheva, the mother of the child. And he came upon her, meaning they slept together. And he lied with her. And she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son. And she called his name Shilomo, right? Which is a name which means peace, or Solomon. And God loved him. Exactly what this means refers to, we will see through the course of his life, but clearly it connotes the impression. It gives us the idea, the impression that Shlomo had a spiritual quality about him, that he was beloved by God. Vayishlach biyad nasan anavi vayikra et shemo Yedidyah, and he sent. And what is here? God sent a message through his prophet Nathan. Vayikra et shemo Yedidyah. And Nathan gave Shlomo the name Yedidyah, or Jedediah, which means beloved of God, or a friend of God. Ba'avur Adonai, on behalf of God Himself. In other words, Nathan gave him that name on behalf of God because God had given Nathan the message to name him Yedidyah. Okay, so that was the story. And then all of a sudden we jump back to the war, which is still ongoing, in Ammon. So Yoav and the soldiers are still fighting against Ammon. How long this war has taken, whether it's years or whether the child died very young and it was a short amount of time, is not made clear in the text itself. But clearly this war is still going on. Vayilachem Yoav b'Rabat b'nei Ammon, and Yoav then waged war against the Rabbah, the city of the capital city of Ammon. Vayilkod et Ir HaMelucha, and he captured the royal city of Ammon. Vayishlach Yoav malachim el David, and Yoav then sent messengers to David. Vayomer nilchamti v'Rabbah, I have waged war against Rabbah. Gam locharti et Ir HaMayim, I have captured the city of water, which presumably is their source of sustenance, the city's source of water. V'ata esof et yeser ha'am, I am going to gather together the remaining troops, the remaining soldiers. V'chanei al ha'ir v'lachta pen el kod ani et ha'ir v'nikra shmi aleh. Because I'm sorry, this is I didn't translate this correctly. Verse 28. And now, so Yoav says, now you gather together the rest of the troops and capture, and you camp on the city and capture it. Because if I capture the city, Nikra Shmi Aleh, then people will say that Yoav was the one that captured it. So Yoav is telling his master, the king, you come here with the soldiers because you're the one that people should be the one that captures the city, so people will remember that it was David who captured the city, and it will be called on David's name. The victory will belong to the king. So remember that this whole thing all started that we've been just reading about because David stayed home and left the work to Yoav. And Yoav is saying now that the big victory is about to happen, at least now you as the king should step in and lead. Vayasov David et kol ha'am. So David gathered the remaining soldiers. Vayelach Rabasa, and he went to Rabbah, Vayelachem Vayilkeda, and he attacked it and captured it. Now that they had taken their water supply and they had the city completely surrounded, the rest of the job was easy. Vayikach et ateret malka me'al rosho, and he took the crown of the king from the king's head, umishkala, and the weight was kikar zahav, was a kikar, a talent or a measurement of a large amount of gold, ve'evan yikara, and there was a precious stone in the crown, vatiel rosh David, and he placed the crown. The crown was placed upon the head of David, ushalalo iro tziar b'miod, and the booty that was taken out of the city of Rabbah was a very large amount. And the people that were within it, he took out. Vayasem ba'megeira, and he placed them to work with. These are tools. Megeira v'charitze habarzel. These are saws and iron threshing boards, and uvimagziros habarzel. And iron axes, or iron picks, v'haviro sam b'malbain, and he brought them to make them, to assign them to make bricks. V'chein ya'aseh l'chol arei bnei Ammon, and this is what he did to all of the outlying cities of the people of Ammon. Vayeshev David v'cholam Yerushalayim, and David and the nation reigned in Jerusalem. In other words, he put them to work to build iron, and iron, obviously was used especially for making weapons, but also he had them making bricks, presumably to help build David's new kingdom, whose basis was in Jerusalem, which is why it says V'chol ha'am Yerushalayim. So the battles continued, and David was still successful, although there isn't a lot of glory given to David in this case, because the city was basically just about conquered anyway, and David just finished off the last bit. But he had the opportunity to have the glory of victory in his name. So we get the sense David's kingdom is moving on, and the first of the suffering that happened in David's house as a result of his sin, we read about the tragic death of his son, and we also see David's reaction, Chatasi Lashem, the simple, heartfelt remorse that he felt, and now he's bracing himself for what's to come, which we will continue reading in future chapters. Thank you for studying this chapter together with me. Looking forward to studying chapter 13 and, of course, the rest of this book of Samuel together.